Hey everyone, welcome back to another lesson. So in this one, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects in the Python, and that is data types. Now, if you remember in the previous lesson where I did this code, when I created this code, we got this error, as you remember. When I got this error, it essentially tells us that can only concatenate string, not integer, to string. So we got this data error type, right? So the question is, what is a integer? And now, since we have that here in front of us, we're going to talk about data types. All right. So the idea with a data type is that in a programming language, you have a few types of data types that you can work with. And the reason you have this is that, for example, you can't, add apples into 25 or 24, for example, because this wouldn't make sense, right? I mean, what is this exactly? You can't add a word into a integer or a number, right? So that's where the data types come in. So far in the previous section and this section, whatever we talked about, we've mainly talked about strings. And a string is essentially a data type that is inside a quotation mark. So for example, name, or like Sean, for example, when we actually say for input equals, please enter your name, right? So this is essentially what we're asking, is that please enter your name, which is going to be inside a string. Anything you see inside this orange, like as an orange here, is essentially a string, which is going to be inside a quotation mark, right? So that is a string. It essentially is a text. Even if you put numbers in a string, like even let's say we put this number here inside a string, it is still a text. It's not a number. For example, the way you actually can prove this is that if I say print, and if I put, let's say 10, and I try to add this into 20, what do you think we're going to get here? Do you think we're going to get 30? We're going to add these two together? No, we're going to get 10, 20, right? There you go. So we just got 10, 20. That is the problem, right? This is a string, not really a number. So this is basically what a string is. And what we're doing here with this plus sign is that we're concatenating it. We're not adding them to each other. So this is where the integers come in. Integers are essentially just numbers, right? And the way you actually define an integer is that you essentially just take this out of the quotation signs, the quotation marks. For example, let's just say integer. And the way you do this again is that you say print, or add a number. For example, I'm gonna say my number, and we can say equals 25. And again, this is not inside a string, inside a quotation mark like we have the strings. This is just a number. Okay, that's as simple as that. This is an integer. All right. So the way you do this, again, if you want to print this, okay, is that print. We can say, for example, 10 plus 25 or 20. So now we're actually going to, let's actually comment this out. So now we're actually going to get 30. Take a look. So there you go. We got 30. See, guys? Now this is how you get an integer. Now there are different ways to define integers. All right. So for example, let's actually make this a comment again. And for example, let's say you have a long number. Let's say we got 25,400, 400, something like that. So let's say even if you have a long number, let's say we get like 25 million, something like that. The problem is that when you actually have a number like this, usually in US or like some other parts of the world, they actually use a comma. That's what they call it. I couldn't remember it. So you use a comma to separate it. But in programming, obviously you can't do that, because if you do this, this is gonna mean a whole different thing. And it's just a problem. So the way you do this is you use an underscore. Essentially, you do this. It looks like that it's a 25,400,000 and 400,727, but in reality it is like that number. If you actually print this, let me actually print this right here, it is 25,400,000, and there you go. So it just displays it like it is supposed to. So again, that's just one way to actually display it for yourself, but that keeps it an integer, so a number, a whole number. All right. Another data type that we're going to talk about is floats. A float is essentially like a integer. The only difference with a float is that it has a decimal point, and that's what they call it float, because each decimal point, let's just get rid of this. All right, sync, it's fine. So a float, we got this float here. So a float essentially is, again, when you got a number, floating number. Let's just give it a like variable. A float is essentially a number that has a decimal point. And the way you can imagine this is like when you define a monetary amount, for example, $1.25 or like $4.30 or something like that. Again, that is a float. Because again, the numbers, integer numbers, they can't be a float because these are whole numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. But a floating number is a decimal point that floats around, and the reason they call it a float, again, is that because a decimal point can be anywhere. It can be like here, right? Obviously that's not a float anymore, but like this is a float. Again, even though if it's 43, but because we got a decimal point and a 0 after, that is a float. So again, that's basically what we call a float, okay? And that's how you define it. For example, the number pi, which is 3.14, is a float, right? If you think about it. So that is a floating number. And the final type that I want to talk about is a Boolean number. This is what we call a Boolean. And the idea with a Boolean is that it's a true and false value. So for example, again, Boolean equals, let's just give it a type, okay, like a variable. And this is either true or false. Either one of these. And these are actually heavily used in your program to actually assess different situations. So Booleans are incredibly important. All right. So again, we got what 4 different data types. We got a string, which is going to be always inside a quotation mark, right? And when you add it, it concatenates, right? It's just like put these like strings together. And it acts as a word. Integer is a full number, okay? And a float is a decimal point, right? And a Boolean is essentially a true or false statement. That's it. Booleans can't be numbers, they can't be words or anything like that. It is a true or false statement. So these are different data types that you're going to be using throughout your program. Let me know if you have any questions about it, because these are very important. And as we talked about it, different, like the way you work with Booleans and the way you work with the strings and stuff like that. If you remember in that code that we had, we were getting that error. For example, let me just pull that right here. If you remember this code that we did, right? We were getting this someone's name, and you wanted to count the characters, and then we wanted to say your name has like X amount of characters. But the problem is that we can't do that. The reason is that because we got a print, and we're printing a string here, right? This is a string, and then we got a string here, but this character is a integer. It's an integer, so that means it's a number. We can't put it inside a string, because if you think about it, this is all a string. So how do we turn this into a character or a string, essentially? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lesson, where we talk about converting different character types to other character types, all right? Or like the data types, essentially. All right, guys? So this is pretty much it. Make sure you understand these stuff, strings and integers and like floats and Booleans. Pretty simple concept if you think about it, but pretty much every programming language has this. So you definitely want to make sure you understand this. Let me know if you have any questions, because we're going to continue and we're going to solve this mystery finally in the next lesson. I'll see you in the next one, guys.